Welcome to Stealing 101. So I will cover what is stealing and its forms at a high level, but I want to focus today on restoration, one of the things that comes out of the lessons of stealing here. So what is stealing? It's a Hebrew word that means to thieve. Imagine that. Whether by force or action, by deceit, or to carry away stealthily or in secret. So it's those three aspects, all encompassed in that one word, that Hebrew word for stealing. First time we actually see this word is three instances altogether at the time when Jacob was leaving Laban. One instance is Jacob was actually avoiding any hint of looking like he was stealing from Laban. But Laban, not so much. But Jacob went out of his way to make sure he could not be accused of stealing. The second instance is Rachel stealing the idols from her father. And the third instance is that Jacob actually stole away. He stole away his family from Haran and when he left Laban. So we're going to talk about those. The first one I want to talk about, this first form, is stealing away, to remove or carry away in secret. So the only way Jacob was actually able to get away from Laban without something being held back of his, most likely his wives, to be held over him, to say, "You will keep working for me," was to steal away. That was the only way he was able to get away, was to steal away. This is not a sin, obviously, but the Bible refers to this type of stealing away as usually a sign of shame. And it's usually associated with this sign of shame. In this case, it was Laban's shame that he had to steal away to keep any kind of peace. The second form is to steal outright. Basically, how Rachel stole the idols from her father's house. And this is the easiest form of stealing to really understand. But this is also where restitution comes in. So this form of stealing obviously is sin. But this is where restitution comes in, which is a really neat aspect that God gave us. So right after the command in Exodus 20, in Exodus 21 and 22, he actually gives us like these forms of restitution what forms are stealing, and then what is the restitution for those, or what's the recompense. So the Bible goes through these rules. I want to go through essentially we're going to talk about this in a few elements, but the first element is the stealing outright. If you steal something outright, if the item is found on you when you're found and it's still intact, then the restitution is twofold. You're supposed to give twofold of whatever it was stolen. If you stole a ram, you're supposed to give twofold ram. But if the item is dead or missing, or if you already consumed it or sold it, then the restitution is 4 to 5-fold what was stolen. Think of it as petty larceny or grand larceny. Think of it that way. But it's 4 to 5-fold. The 5-fold is reserved usually for the oxen, and the 4-fold for like the sheep and smaller items. And if you weren't able to make the payment, you were sold into slavery as a form of payment, but also as a reform for the person that basically were stealing and couldn't afford to take care of themselves. So the third form of stealing is through deception or dereliction, not doing what it is you're responsible to do. So either through outright deception or through dereliction of duty. That's what Jacob was trying desperately to avoid any hint of or perception of, because he knew how Laban dealt with things. And he did not want to give Laban any extra fodder. So let's talk about quickly deception. Deception was settled. How was that resolved? So deception was resolved actually by going to the judges. So it wasn't an outright, because it is deception. By nature, it needs a mediator. So it went to the judges, and if they determined there was indeed a theft, or taking something or not giving what it should have been promised, what was promised, then the payment was twofold, typically twofold. And if you were derelict in doing something that you were in charge of, for instance, and you lost, that was actually it was a 1-for-1. It was a like for like. So that includes life. So it was a life for life. If you lost a life or caused a life to be lost, then it would be life as well. So, and then another, if it was a property was accidentally burned up or stolen or destroyed, then you would actually have to give from the best of your property to restore that. So those are kind of the examples of deception and dereliction. Or the explanation. I want to go through a few examples as well that God gave us. For example of deception, to help understand what this is, it's like the diverse weights that are abomination to God, or the dishonest scales as well. These are things that God really does not like. It's because they have the appearance of being fair, of being fair, making fair dealings, but they are completely the opposite. Another example of this is when Absalom went before the gates of Jerusalem, and he was receiving the people that wanted judgment from David, and he would politic essentially with them and tell them, listen to and actually make some good decisions, but he was trying to basically undermine his father. Which he did. It says that Absalom stole the hearts of the people by doing that. So he's purposely undermining. So again, he appears righteous, but it's for nefarious deeds. And then finally, example in Jeremiah is where God himself said, I am against the prophets. Well, why was he against the prophets? He says, who steal my words, everyone from his neighbor. How did they steal their words? He explains this, but basically, they were adding chaff to the wheat. In other words, they were adding more to the messages that he told them to give. So they were either softening them down, or they were trying to make it easy for the people to hear. They weren't being as corrective as they should have been because the people needed it. But they were softening it down, thinking they were doing a good job by softening it down or making it weak, or maybe there were some kickbacks involved. But for whatever reason, God hated those prophets. He was against them for stealing his words. Examples of dereliction now. So dereliction, there's several actual examples. A lot of people, when you're raising kids, they can say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Well, you learn really quickly that you are responsible for all of your actions. So that's kind of what this is. So here's some examples. So if they were punishing a slave and they maimed them, then that slave would gain freedom because of the loss of their eye or the loss of their limb or something if they were injured in such a way. If you got injured through a struggle and you injured somebody, you would actually have to pay for their lost time. That's actually in the Bible too. You would have to pay for their lost time while they recovered from that injury. Another example is if you caused a woman to lose her baby. That's a life for life. If you actually cause a woman in a struggle, even on accident, to lose her baby, that's a life for life situation. You are also responsible for hazards that you should be protecting the public from or animals from. So for instance, if an animal gored another person to death, that animal had to be destroyed. But if you knew as the owner that that animal was prone to doing that, was dangerous, then you, the owner, would also lose your life. And then if you left a pit open, for instance, and an animal fell in and died, you would have to restore that animal. So those are some examples. I also mentioned, too, that dereliction can be not providing something that you're supposed to provide for your society, for your people as a people. So, for instance, if you do not provide for the poor or the stranger so that they can provide for themselves, as well as providing for the widows and fatherless. And there's many scriptures on this, but one that comes to mind is that after the Feast of Weeks, it says that when you're reaping your harvest, you leave the corners. You don't gather the gleanings, so the stuff that fell on the ground. You're actually supposed to leave that for the strangers and the poor so that they can harvest themselves. That's something you're actually supposed to do. So let's skip down now. Another example is vows. So Ananias and Sapphira is a very good example of vows. If you make a vow, you're obligated to give it. So let's ask this quick question here. Learning all that, let's ask this quick question. So does God require restoration or forgiveness? Those two kind of seem contradictory, right? I mean, if you forgive somebody, why require restitution? How does that make any sense? So what does God require? Restitution or restoration or forgiveness? He requires both. Does a good father forgive but still require punishment or to work off or make sure that son repays the damage that he caused? Of course he does. If he didn't, he would raise an irresponsible kid. So he requires both. If you're a leader and someone has actually failed doing a job, you forgive them for that, but you still require maybe a bigger challenge. You don't just take more away from them. You give them a bigger challenge and say, can you live up to this? Because by living up to this, you can reinstill trust. But if trust is never reinstilled, the relationship is never repaired. So it takes both. It takes forgiveness and restitution or restoration. So I want to point out an example of this. If you'll start turning to Numbers 3, it's an unlikely place to point out an example of this from God the Father to Israel. This is actually an example of him requiring restitution from Israel. But to do that, I want to cover, while you're going there, to Numbers 3, and we'll start in verse 5. But while we're going there, I want to cover two background things to this. So one background is the Passover. So at the Passover, when God passed over and saved the firstborn, he bought the firstborn. By him saving by him passing over and not killing them that night, he actually bought them. He bought the firstborn of Israel. And we'll go into that a little bit more. But the other background I'd like to give you is at the end of Leviticus, he goes into the valuation of people, of the men and women of Israel, in order to do vows and to do the redemption of those vows, to know what the value of them was for that purpose and for the purpose we're about to see. So, for instance, males from 1 month to 5 years were worth 5 shekels. From 5 years old to 20, they were worth 20 shekels. From 20 to 60, when you could get the most work out of them, and their age of service, when they were allowed to go to war, for instance, their worth was 50 shekels, and at 60 plus, their worth went back down to 15. It's not a commentary, it's just you can't get as much work, right? So let's start in Numbers 3:15. So now, having that background, we're going to go through this example of how God actually used this to restore Israel back to this trusted state, instead of them always hanging out, knowing their firstborn were going to continue to go to God. Okay. And the Lord spoke, so this is Numbers 3, verse 8. I'm going to read 3 verse 5. I'm going to read 5 through 7. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Bring the tribe of Levi near and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him, and they shall attend to his needs and the needs of the whole congregation before the tabernacle of meeting to do the work of the tabernacle." So he's in the process of giving the Levites to the Levitical priesthood to do this work, for them as well as for all of the people. Okay, so let's skip down to verse 12, and we'll read 12 through 15. And it says, "Now behold, I myself," this is God talking, "I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel instead of every firstborn." Instead of every firstborn, who he bought already. He's taken the Levites instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. "Therefore, the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself all the firstborn of Israel." He bought them, took them, set them apart. Both man and beast, they shall be mine. I am the Lord. So let's skip down to verse 39. We'll start reading, picking it back up there. So I don't want to read how they counted everybody. They counted all of Israel in chapters 1 and 2 of Numbers, and then they counted the Levites at the beginning of chapter 3. And then at the end here, 39, it actually says how much they numbered. It says, all who were numbered of the Levites, whom Moses and Aaron numbered at the commandment of the Lord by their families, all of the males a month old and above were 22,000. So 22,000 people were the men of Israel from a month and older. All those ones that had valuations at the end of Leviticus. Let's continue in verse 40. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, number all the firstborn males of the children of Israel from a month old and above, and take the number of their names. So you numbered everybody of the Levites now, and then you took that number of Israel as well. And let's skip down to 43, where we actually see that number. And all the firstborn males, according to the number of names, from a month old and above. And he did it by names because he didn't want to double count anybody or miss anyone, right? From a month old and above, of those who were numbered of them were 22,273. So there was an extra 273 of Israelite firstborns compared to the Levites. Compared to all the Levites, not just their firstborn. Firstborn of Israel and the Levites. So skipping down to 46, it says, and for the redemption of the 273, so it wasn't just enough that he's saying, I'm going to make this trade. He's making it all the way. 273 of the firstborn of the children of Israel, who are more than the number of the Levites, 45, you shall take 5 shekels for each one individually. So he took the lowest denomination, the 5 months to the 1 month to 5-year-old. He said, you shall take them in the currency of the shekel of the sanctuary and the shekel of 2 gerah, and you shall give the money with which the excess number of them is redeemed to Aaron and his sons. And we see that in verse 50, and we'll read that real quick. From the firstborn of the children of Israel, he took the money, 1,365 shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. So what's this tell us? So God worked it out, the restoration, down to the shekel. That's the emphasis God put on this, because it does restore a relationship. So in God's mercy, he provided a way, not only here, but he provides a way in all of these instances to restore what was caused to be lost. Do we understand just how important that is, that we have that ability to restore what has been lost? We can never repay what was paid for our sins, but as called out ones, heirs to the kingdom, we should always strive to restore any perceived or actual loss, as Jacob did, and be examples of our calling and our Father in heaven.